Join us for the Criterion Institute podcast as Joy Anderson, a global thought leader in business and social change, leads us through a series of discussions, interviews, frameworks, rants, and reframes that will help you better understand how to use finance as a tool for transformative systems change.
I am Joy Anderson, and this is the Criterion Institute podcast. Today, I'm focusing on masculinity, watching what's happening in the U.S. government right now, beginning of February 2025. It's an unchecked exercise of male privilege, a kind of celebration of brodom and kind of masculinity that when you walk into a bar, you look over and go, ugh, does that have to exist? And so in today's episode, I'm going to reflect a little bit on a new idea for me, playing with the idea of how do we make the business case for good men? So forgive me. This is the beginning of an idea. This is about putting ideas out to spur thought, not a fully baked thesis. The second part of the episode is a recording I did with my dad about 2 years ago. I sat with him for a day before I launched the podcast and recorded about a dozen recordings that have come out over time. And so I'm really glad to use this recording today because my father, my husband, I'm surrounded by men who are trying every day and are good. And they look out at the world and see what others in their gender are doing and sigh. So, to the good men out there, enjoy. I always had a bit of an uneasy tension between men and gender lens investing. Not because I wouldn't love men to be part of it. I work with lots of men who are great gender lens investors. I truly don't believe you need to have a uterus to do a gender analysis. And yet I pause in those moments and cringe a little bit when somebody on stage in a gathering says, you know what we need? We need more men here. And I always think, why? Why do we need more men here? This is a gathering finally where we're focused on what we want to be focused on. And does it really have to have men? So I've always been ambiguous about this. But I've also been thinking, some level of frustration, we never seem to have any data about men. We don't make business cases that are built on men, whether they're business cases of opportunity or business cases of risk. Men are allies, or they're wrapped up in the broad picture of the patriarchy. But they do seem a little bit invisible, but not these days. Maybe just the visceral nature of it all, but it's clear that there are political risks, rule of law risks, stability risks that are coming from a performance of masculinity, and it can almost be directly tied to it. The sense of privilege, and not just like unfiltered privilege or unaware privilege. This is a sense of entitlement as if somehow it's been taken from them by somebody. A sense of entitlement at risk that's leading to some of the most horrific behavior in the history of the United States. I think we can clearly show risks of toxic masculinity. risks of a style of leadership that puts companies, nations, communities at risk. We could document that pretty clearly. And to say when you see that kind of masculinity emerging, it's not a company risk as much as a market risk, a culture that we're all swimming in, and figuring out which companies can stand out, which companies maybe they don't need to be led by women instead. I know I sound like a heretic, but maybe they just need to be led by good men. And it is good men who create more diverse workforces. It's enlightened folks who are not living in a defensive world justifying why they should keep their power. So I want to think about the business case for good men. We make the business case for women. Maybe we should be making the business case for good women. I don't think all women do things great. And I do know that some men truly are great. So we could start setting up profiles of good leaders, good men. We've probably just called this good leadership, and maybe it isn't necessary to call it out as about men, but we somehow have these weird assumptions that when it's women, it's going to be good, and if it's men, it's going to be not good. But I do think there are characteristics of male leaders where they shine, where they share, where they collaborate, and we should hold that up. And the second thing I worry about is that it is increasingly hard to be a good man. Male privilege, and maybe here we should be clear, this is really white male privilege. Black men in the United States, Muslim men in the United States, different experience of walking down the street, experiencing violence, trying to work at a job and not be under threat. Race is important when it's intersected with masculinity. But just like we look at structural inequities that face women, there are some profound structural inequities that undermine good men. One, simply cultural norms. What you are told to be a man, can undermine the ability to be a good one. The second is things like pornography. Many of my friends who have male children worry about this at an intrinsic level. The visibility of violence in pornography that is so easily available warps not only what they think about women, but about what they see as themselves, what they see as possible. And the final piece, again, I'm naming this as a half-baked idea, not fully out there, but a friend of mine, Sean Lesser, has been building out a movement around men's mental health. And one of the statistics that he shared with me was that men die by suicide at a rate nearly 4 times higher than women. I know a good bit about that statistic. It's not how many times they attempt suicide, but how many times they die as a result of the act. Men are more likely than women to misuse drugs. About 6 million men in the United States alone suffer from depression annually. Now, most of these statistics are about men in the US. The numbers globally, the stories that I hear about men in Africa and other places as their worlds unravel, and the suicide that comes from that. I actually grew up in Dubuque, Iowa, in the height of the farm crisis. And in my high school, there were several gun accidents in my class, all of which in the end were suicides of men who no longer saw their future. So the question is, what do we do? And what can we do to both highlight what we've been doing in gender lens investing for years is to highlight the importance of seeing gender. And I believe it is vitally important to focus on women, to hold up gender patterns that are about women, because in general, they are less examined than the lives of men. And the lives of men are assumed to be normalized. They are assumed to be what happens, and women are the exception. So all of those make the data distorted and how we research it distorted. But somewhere in the midst of this, it's getting harder and harder, it appears, to stand up and do what's right. And we really need that right now. One of the things that I'm struck by in this movement away from diversity and inclusion is that a whole bunch of people who were on board with this when it was convenient are just not now, right? They'll probably come back when as soon as it's convenient again. But that's just soul sucking to not be able to live through the convictions that you've made. So they're not the victims. The people who are having their lives destroyed, their businesses destroyed, they're the victims. But we might need to shine a light on some questions about masculinity, some questions about how do we invest in good men, because they're needed. One of my thoughts, and I'll make this the final one, is we always think about allies, right? There's a whole approach to this change that's about allyship, and that men should be allies for women. Honestly, I think men need to figure out how to also be allies to other good men, to carry the burden and push and say, you can do more, you can stand up, you can push back. This is about you. And this is about the world we want to live in. I invited my dad, Herbert Anderson, an influential theologian, to reflect with me on some ideas that he's worked on for a long time that have shaped my thinking. And so this segment is focused on masculinity, power,
and vulnerability.
And just as a little bit of context, I mean, there's just been so many conversations in the field of gender lens investing so I've really been looking forward to this conversation, because in the field of gender lens investing, we often say, let's remember that gender is about all genders, not just about women. And so the need to really dig into masculinity has been a topic of conversation within gender lens investing. So thrilled to talk with my dad, who's written a bunch about this. And so where are we starting?
Well, we're starting in 1976, and you will remember that your mother left us back in Dubuque, Iowa, to go back to Philadelphia as a part of her training. And so it was you and me and Joel for 3 months. And I mark that as a time when I had to totally think differently about my place in the family, my responsibilities as a husband and as a father. And I had to cook. We had to make meals, the three of us. I suspect then and now that continues to be difficult for men to talk with one another about things that matter to us as men. I suppose that the rest of the time in Dubuque, Iowa was fine. And then we went off to Chicago, and I was married to a woman who had very big jobs that took her on the road a lot. And so I was able to fashion 3 different kinds of groups of men that I was a part of. partly to keep me from misbehaving, but partly because I needed to talk to men about what it was to be a man and to think about issues about masculinity. And so I wrote some things. I tried to challenge a book that came out about men, in which the title of the book was Magician, Lover, King, and Warrior. Now, those are images about being a man that I tried to counter with my four, which were gardener, friend, sage, and peacemaker. It was a little article that went absolutely nowhere, but eventually I was invited by the Presbyterian Church to write a book on men. And about the same time, while I was writing that book, I followed my wife's career for the second time. I became a grandfather. I retired, and I had prostate cancer. So all of a sudden, those were male issues. And so the book turned out, it's called Jacob's Shadow, and went nowhere. But it's a very close personal story to my own life. And what I learned most of all from having prostate cancer is that the male anatomy has this little body part, which we believe to be the origin of our power and potency, which is, in a way, but it's also the source of the greatest vulnerability for men to cancer. So I had prostate cancer, and all the consequences of prostate cancer were mine as well. That was in 1999, and this is 2022. So I'm very grateful for the years after that. But that became really, for me, the kind of the primary metaphor for thinking about the issue that men face over and over again in 1,000 different ways. How do we find a way of balancing power with vulnerability that don't cancel one or the other out? That the presumption is that if we acknowledge that we're vulnerable, if we acknowledge that we have a trouble, or if we acknowledge that we have been diagnosed with a sickness that we don't want anybody to know about, for fear that someone will diminish will say we've lost our power. So we don't acknowledge our being vulnerable, as all human creatures are vulnerable. And at the same time, we don't celebrate our power, our appropriate power to make things happen, to get things done, to build, to take adventures, to accomplish things, to create. The book went into a huge sinkhole, but not my thinking about masculinity. And I suppose there was one story that from that time of leaving Chicago, because then I followed my wife's career to Seattle and eventually to Berkeley. But I was teaching a class in a Catholic school, and I wanted to announce to the school that my wife had just accepted this position in Seattle, Washington, and I'm not going to be leaving the school. I'm going to commute between Seattle and Chicago for 3 years, 2 years actually, what I did for 2 years. And so I said, I'm going to follow my wife's career again. And the student, without raising a hand, said, "You're a wuss." Never forgotten. Because it is precisely what keeps us trapped in patterns of thinking about masculinity that are finally destructive to being human as men. Not long ago, I was invited to write something about toxic masculinity. and about how can we begin to address it. And I don't know. It's so deep. It's so pervasive. I alternate between hopeful that maybe we're going to inch our way forward and begin to embrace a new vision of humanity as men. And then we get new celebration of being a bully, and new patterns of masculinity by leaders in the government and around the world. Bullies are big. They're in. Everybody wants a bully. So I don't know. But I think some things have to change for us to begin to think about being men differently. One is hierarchy. I mean, we're trapped in hierarchical thinking, and that's just not a problem for men. That's a human problem. And we are so trapped in hierarchical thinking that it is very difficult for us from time to time to think that there isn't somebody's up and somebody's down. How do we play on a level playing field? And there are social institutions then that are embedded in perpetuating this kind of hierarchy. I think our language is a problematic thing, and how we can shake loose from language that is always diminishing, that diminishes women in ways that are inappropriate and so diminish men. And I think we need to foster a whole new understanding of multiple masculinities. That is, and establish just bonds between men and women. My daughter-in-law and then my son, my daughter-in-law started by writing an article on just love. And she said that love is not enough to sustain a marriage today. Justice needs to be added to love at the core of marriage. And I think justice needs to be connected to all kinds of human relationships between men and men, between men and women, between women and women. That is how we foster bonds of affection and of love and companionship and collegiality. And we do it always with justice in mind. And then we need to learn how to share power and acknowledge vulnerability, because they are the unavoidable dimensions of reimagining masculinity. I don't have a simple solution. I have more passion than I have wisdom, but I speak. Joy and I have talked about this often, and I applaud what she's doing, what Criterion is doing to address issues of gender violence. But it's a problem created by men and created by systems that men perpetuate and that women and men perpetuate. And I don't know. I don't know if that's what you wanted, Joy, but that's from the heart.
Thank you so much. So how do we take all of this and keep thinking about how to disrupt power and where systems of finance can play into that? Because some of those hierarchies, some of those places where toxic masculinity is celebrated and flourishes, sit, right? Looking now, looking down the valley. I'm sitting in Sonoma right now with my father and looking down at the valley and seeing what's happening right now in Silicon Valley one more time, where we're deciding again that the vision of masculinity that came out of venture capital is appropriate and good and wins despite its emblematic failures. We still celebrate it as what's working. And I think what's so important about this is in each of these pieces of, we spend so much time struggling with how to talk about gender. We don't spend as much time as you have spent struggling with how to talk about masculinity.
No. I understand. I totally agree. And I'm in 3 men's groups now here in Sonoma, one of which was we gather monthly to sip single malt scotch. But to get those men's groups to talk seriously about what it is to be a man, and to have and what we want to pass on to our grandchildren and our great grandchildren, should we have them. That's not easy, and I've gotten pushback, and I keep trying.
So how do we work hard to create a space to talk about gender? How do we make sure that in that space we are truly wrestling with things that we don't have answers to yet? Which
exactly.
is, how do we transform, how do we reimagine masculinity as we transform systems of gender to be more just?
I think if I were to say, I don't know, I mean, you're talking a lot about power.
Yep.
And how we need to level the playing field in terms of power. I want to say, maybe at the same time, we need to have conversations about vulnerability.
Yeah.
It's about physical vulnerability. It's about bodily vulnerability. It's about emotional vulnerability. And practice living vulnerably. Because the world is not safe. Companies are not always safe. Relationships are not always safe. We can work towards making them safe by making them more just. But I think, I don't know whether this makes sense to you, Joy, but it seems to me that for men and women alike, keeping this balance that I discovered when I had prostate cancer between power and vulnerability, keeping that alive.
Yep, 100%. And how do we keep being honest about that, having open conversations about it, addressing how it affects systems and relationships in the world, and be honest about it in the midst of it.
And finance.
Absolutely. Throughout it. Thank you so much, Dad.
To learn more about our work, visit us at criterioninstitute.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your reviews help our podcast reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.